I had been the chief operating officer of Pinnacle Systems for 3 years when the company hired Trevor Ashford as the new CEO, and within 6 weeks of his arrival, I understood that he had been brought in specifically to push me out while maintaining the appearance of an orderly executive transition. Pinnacle was a mid-sized enterprise software company based in Seattle with about 900 employees and $420 million in annual revenue, specializing in supply chain optimization platforms for manufacturing and logistics companies. And I had been responsible for building the operational infrastructure that had allowed the company to scale from $180 million to its current size over a period of 5 years. The board had hired Trevor from a larger competitor where he had held the title of Chief Revenue Officer, and they had been impressed by his track record of aggressive growth, his polished presentation style, and his confidence in articulating a vision for how Pinnacle could accelerate its market expansion and position itself for either an IPO or a strategic acquisition within 18 months. What the board did not understand, because they had not done the operational due diligence that would have revealed it, was that Trevor's previous company had grown revenue through accounting maneuvers and channel stuffing rather than sustainable customer acquisition. Trevor's the video was exactly 37 seconds long, low resolution and washed out by the fluorescent lights of the underground parking garage, but it captured the moment my professional life fractured into before and after with clinical, indifferent precision. In the footage, I was walking toward my car carrying my laptop bag and a slim folder of documents, my badge still clipped to my blazer, when Daniel Mercer, the Chief Risk Officer of Helixure Insurance, stepped into frame, cut off my path, and jabbed a finger into my chest hard enough that my body rocked back a half step. The CCTV angle did not capture his words, but it captured everything else. His posture leaning in, crowding my space, my hands held deliberately at my sides, the folder he snatched from me and waved in my face, the moment he threw it onto the concrete and the papers scattered, the small, controlled movement with which I knelt to pick them up while he turned away, laughing over his shoulder to someone just outside the frame. That 37 seconds would loop on national news 6 months later, annotated by commentators who had never met me and knew nothing about the regulatory filing in that folder, the internal politics, or the years of quiet work that had led up to that moment. But I knew, watching it for the first time on a grainy monitor in the corporate security office 3 days after it happened, that this was not just humiliation, it was leverage, and leverage, used precisely, changes everything. Helixure was a regional health and disability insurer based in Minneapolis, about 1,500 employees and $2.1 billion in annual premium, and I had joined 5 years earlier as Director of Compliance after a decade in regulatory consulting and a stint at a state insurance department. My job was simple in theory and impossible in practice. Ensure that our products, processes, and claims decisions complied with an overlapping set of regulations from state insurance commissioners, the Department of Labor for ERISA plans, and, increasingly, federal agencies concerned with data privacy and anti-discrimination. When I arrived, Helixure's compliance posture was reactive and fragmented, policies in binders no one read, training modules that were clicked through in silent resentment, and a culture that regarded compliance as a bureaucratic tax rather than a core operational constraint. Over 5 years, I built a real program, risk-based monitoring, integrated claims audits, a governance structure that rooted new product designs through legal and compliance review before launch, and a reporting framework to the board's Audit and Risk Committee that told them in plain language where we were exposed. It was unglamorous work. When it functioned, nothing dramatic happened, and because nothing dramatic happened, people like Daniel convinced themselves that the constraints were optional. Daniel joined as Chief Risk Officer 2 years after me, imported from a national carrier where his reputation was built on transformational risk frameworks and his ability to speak in glossy slides. On paper, we were peers. He owned enterprise risk, capital adequacy, and models. I owned regulatory compliance, complaints, and internal controls. In reality, he considered compliance a subset of risk and me a senior functionary who should feed his dashboards and stay out of his way. In his first month, he rebranded the Risk and Compliance Committee as the Enterprise Resilience Council, pushed me off the standing agenda, and replaced my detailed quarterly findings with a single composite compliance heat score he generated from self-reported questionnaires. When I pointed out that self-reports from line managers whose bonuses depended on productivity were not reliable control evidence, he smiled in the way men do when they think you're being difficult and said executives needed simple metrics, not legalistic caveats. HelixSure's growth strategy hinged on an entry into the short-term disability market for large self-insured employers, a lucrative line if managed correctly, a regulatory minefield if not. The product Daniel wanted to push, branded FlexGuard, promised employers lower premiums in exchange for tighter claims criteria and aggressive fraud screening. There was nothing inherently illegal in that proposition, but the implementation mattered. I reviewed the draft policy language and the claims handling procedures the product team had developed under Daniel's fast lane guidance, and I saw a problem immediately. They were proposing to auto-deny entire categories of mental health-related disability claims after a fixed number of weeks, unless claimants met criteria that went far beyond medical necessity standards, and quietly excluded most stress, anxiety, and depression cases. It was exactly the sort of systemic discrimination the Department of Labor and several state commissioners had been scrutinizing for years. I wrote a formal memo, 9 pages, footnoted with citations to ERISA regulations, state unfair claims practices acts, and recent enforcement actions against competitors who had tried similar tactics. I did not label it as an objection. I labeled it Regulatory Risk Assessment, FlexGuard short-term disability product, and concluded with 3 options. Redesign the criteria, segregate certain employer segments into a different policy form, or proceed but disclose the risk in our ORSA own risk and solvency assessment, filing with an explicit remediation plan. I sent it to Daniel, the general counsel, and the head of product. The general counsel responded within an hour asking to discuss. Daniel did not respond at all. The next day, my calendar invite to the FlexGuard go-no-go meeting disappeared. The meeting still happened without me. The decision was go. When the minutes were circulated, my risk assessment was summarized in 1 line. Compliance notes potential regulatory headwinds, risk view is manageable. I went to Daniel's office, closed the door, and asked him directly whether he had read my memo. He said he had skimmed it and that, in his view, I was overstating the risk. Our competitors were doing far worse, regulators were slow, and in any case he had modeled the potential fines and legal costs and concluded that even in a downside scenario the product's profitability justified the exposure. I asked whether he had cleared that calculus with the board's risk committee. He said that was an executive judgment, not a board matter. The conversation ended politely. The relationship did not. Over the next 6 months, FlexGuard grew fast. The sales team loved it. Employer-side consultants loved it. Our loss ratio looked beautiful. Internally, every time a claims examiner tried to push back on the auto-denial protocols, they were reminded that risk and legal have signed off. I had done no such thing, but Daniel's composite compliance heat score remained green because on paper the controls existed. The first serious complaint came from a mid-sized tech company in Denver, whose HR director wrote a detailed letter describing multiple employees with documented depressive episodes, whose disability claims had been terminated despite ongoing treatment and medical certification. She copied the Colorado Division of Insurance. That was my jurisdiction. I opened an internal investigation. I requested a sample of FlexGuard claims files focusing on mental health-related cases that had been terminated at the policy's arbitrary cutoff points. What I found was not ambiguous. Claims were being shut off by an automated rule engine based on diagnosis codes and duration alone, with no individualized assessment beyond a cursory nurse review. Appeal letters sent to claimants used boilerplate language that misstated policy terms in ways that discouraged further challenge. In at least 3 cases, internal medical reviewers had recommended extending benefits, and their notes had been overridden by a policy override directive attached to a workflow-tagged CRO exception framework. That was Daniel's program. I documented everything: sample selection methodology, file notes, override patterns, the discrepancy between actual practice and our filed policy forms. I drafted a response to the Colorado regulator that acknowledged process inconsistencies, proposed remediation, and promised a broader internal review. Before sending it per protocol, I routed it through Daniel and the General Counsel. The General Counsel called me within minutes, clearly alarmed. She agreed this was serious. Daniel sent me a calendar invite instead. Parking garage P3 level 1800. No subject line, no agenda, just that. There was no legitimate business reason for a senior executive conversation in the underground parking garage after business hours. I knew that. I also knew Daniel was careful about written records. If he wanted a conversation off the grid, he would choose a place with no official minutes, no Outlook traces beyond the invite, and he assumed no ears. What he had not considered was eyes. Helixsure leased its headquarters in a multi-tenant office complex. The parking garage was managed by the property company, not us. Their CCTV system fed into a control room run by a third-party security contractor with its own data retention policies independent of Helixsure's. I had learned that 3 years earlier when investigating an employee assault allegation and had filed the fact away. Cameras everywhere, but not ours. As I walked down the concrete ramp to level P3 that evening, I glanced up at the dome cameras mounted near the fire doors, small black hemispheres in the ceiling corners, and I positioned myself squarely under one of them before Daniel appeared. He arrived 5 minutes late, tie loosened, the performative casualness of a man who wanted to signal that this was an informal discussion in which norms could be bent. He did not waste time. He told me, in a tight, controlled voice, that my draft response to the Colorado regulator was unacceptable, that my language implied systemic wrongdoing when there had only been isolated process drift, and that if we used my draft, we would be inviting a multi-state market conduct exam that would destroy shareholder value. Then he stepped closer enough that I could smell the expensive whiskey on his breath, jabbed his finger into my sternum, and demanded that I redraft the letter to admit nothing and commit only to ongoing quality reviews. When I did not respond immediately, he grabbed the folder from my hand, the one containing my memo and the complaint letter, flipped it open, laughed, and tossed it down. Papers fanned across the oil-stained concrete. The camera watched all of it. In the moment, I felt two things layered on top of each other, a cold, almost impersonal assessment of risk and the hot, familiar flush of humiliation. I had spent 15 years building a career on professional judgment and measured language, and here I was being physically cornered and treated like a disobedient junior analyst in a parking garage. I did not give him the reaction he wanted. I picked up the papers, told him calmly that I would consider his comments, and walked away. I drove home, sat at my kitchen table, and wrote everything down while it was fresh. Exact phrases, exact movements, the smell, the time stamp from my phone. Then, before I slept, I scheduled a meeting with corporate security for the next morning regarding incident in P3. When I asked whether there were cameras covering that area, she nodded and said yes. The property manager system had line of sight over P3's pedestrian exits. But here was the part that mattered. The footage was not Helixsure's asset. It belonged to the property company, and access required a logged request, typically for law enforcement or internal investigations. Carla understood chain of custody. She also understood what it meant when a C-level executive asked for help documenting an incident involving another C-level. We sat together in the small, dim control room while she placed the request to the property manager, framed as a safety concern. 2 hours later, we had the 37-second clip. We watched it twice in silence. On screen, with the audio stripped away, Daniel's behavior looked even worse. The body language, the aggressive proximity, the visible jab, the thrown folder. There was no context to soften it, no argument about misinterpretation. It was, in visual form, what employment lawyers call objective corroboration. Carla burned a copy to an encrypted drive, logged the chain of custody entry, and asked me what I wanted to do. I told her I wanted to follow policy. Policy in this case meant filing a formal complaint with HR, providing the video, and triggering an investigation. She raised both eyebrows slightly. She had seen what happened to people who pushed back against executives, but she didn't argue. I submitted the complaint within the hour. Helixsure's HR department had two modes, procedural and defensive. For mid-level employees, it followed process. For executives, it calculated risk. Within 24 hours of my complaint, the head of HR, the general counsel, and the CEO were all aware of the video. Daniel, of course, was too. The official response came in the form of a meeting request, HR/legal/compliance workplace conduct concern. The meeting room was small, windowless, and overconditioned. HR began with empathy scripts about taking concerns seriously. Legal asked neutral questions about context. The CEO, a man whose primary talent was avoiding direct involvement in conflict, said very little. When Carla plugged in the drive and played the footage, the temperature in the room changed. No one spoke for almost a full minute after it ended. Then the CEO cleared his throat and said something about how this looked bad, but that they needed to consider the totality of Daniel's contributions. HR shifted into risk management mode, talking about coaching, executive development, and restoring working relationships. Legal asked whether I would be open to mediation. They expected me to accept a quiet resolution. Daniel would receive a confidential reprimand. I would be encouraged to find ways to collaborate more constructively, and the footage would be locked in a restricted folder, never to be mentioned again. I had something else in mind. I said that before discussing any personal resolution, we needed to address the underlying issue that had led to the confrontation, the regulatory risk associated with FlexGuard and the draft letter to the Colorado Division of Insurance. I slid copies of my memo and the draft response across the table. I explained in precise language that the conduct captured on video was not an isolated outburst but a manifestation of structural pressure to downplay compliance concerns in favor of short-term profitability. Then I asked the general counsel a direct question. In her professional judgment, given the pattern in the claims files and the representations we had made to regulators and clients, did she believe we could sign our upcoming ORSA attestation in good faith without disclosing the FlexGuard issue? The question was not about Daniel, it was about the company's legal posture. It shifted the frame. The general counsel was not a coward. She had been at a big law firm long enough to know the smell of a case that could spiral into discovery, subpoenas, and headlines. She said carefully that she needed to review the claims evidence in more detail, but that, on the face of my memo, she had serious concerns. She also said that any attempt to alter or withhold relevant information from a regulator's inquiry could expose HelixSure to allegations of bad faith and potential punitive damages. Those were words with weight. The CEO frowned. HR looked uncomfortable. Daniel notably was not in the room. This was officially just a concern meeting. I let the silence sit. Then I said that, given the gravity of the regulatory issues and the conduct captured on video, I believed the board's Audit and Risk Committee needed to be informed. I did not threaten. I did not raise my voice. I invoked governance. Boards do not like surprises, especially not ones involving regulators, potential class actions, and video evidence of their chief risk officer physically intimidating their director of compliance in a parking garage. The general counsel requested time to manage the communication. I gave her 48 hours. When I had not received confirmation that the Audit and Risk Committee had been briefed by then, I used a mechanism executives often forget exists. The direct reporting line from compliance to the board, established in HelixSure's own charter. I drafted a concise, factual memo to the Audit and Risk Committee chair summarizing 3 elements: the FlexGuard regulatory risk, the pattern of internal pushback on disclosure, and the incident in the parking garage, noting that video evidence existed and was in legal's possession. I did not attach the footage. I did not editorialize. I sent it to the committee chair's secure board email, copying only the general counsel as required. The response was swift. The Audit and Risk Committee chair, a former insurance regulator herself, called the CEO and demanded an emergency committee meeting with outside counsel present. Within a week, HelixSure had retained an external law firm specializing in insurance regulatory enforcement and corporate investigations, along with an independent forensic audit firm. The investigation mandate was broad: review FlexGuard product design and claims handling, assess regulatory compliance, and evaluate whether any executives had interfered with compliance reporting or retaliated against those raising concerns. That last clause had my fingerprints all over it, and everyone knew it. Once outside counsel was in the building, the dynamic shifted. I turned over everything: my memos, internal emails, claims file analyses, and a chronology of my interactions with Daniel on FlexGuard, including his instructions to soften regulatory communications. The forensic team pulled a statistically significant sample of FlexGuard claims, focusing on mental health denials. Their findings matched and amplified mine: systemic auto-denials of valid claims, override of medical reviewers, a materially misleading internal policy description, and training materials that instructed claims staff to remind claimants of their duty to return to work, in ways that effectively discouraged appeals. The external law firm interviewed claims examiners, product managers, HR, and, eventually, Daniel. The CCTV footage, once outside counsel obtained its own copy from the property manager via subpoena, became more than an HR problem. It became potential evidence of retaliation and obstruction. In their interview, they asked me not just about the incident itself, but about its context. What had I been carrying? What had we been discussing? What had Daniel demanded? When they interviewed him, they already knew the answers. The investigation took 8 weeks. During that time, FlexGuard remained on the market, but under a quiet freeze. No new employer groups were sold, and claims protocols were put under temporary review. Internally, rumors swirled. People knew something was happening, they didn't know what. I continued doing my job, overseeing other regulatory filings, monitoring other products, answering outside counsel's follow-ups. I did not gossip. I did not grandstand. I understood that the most powerful thing I could do now was be relentlessly boring and correct. The report, when it came, was devastating. The external law firm concluded that HelixSure's FlexGuard product design and claims handling practices presented material regulatory risk, that the auto-denial protocols likely violated multiple state unfair claims handling statutes, and that failure to disclose these issues in regulatory filings could constitute bad faith. They also concluded that the CCTV footage, combined with witness testimony and email evidence, supported a finding that Daniel had attempted to pressure compliance into downplaying these risks and had engaged in conduct that could reasonably be interpreted as retaliation or intimidation. They recommended immediate remedial action: suspension of FlexGuard sales, a comprehensive claims review with retroactive corrections, self-reporting to affected state regulators, and removal of individuals responsible for undermining compliance functions from their roles. The Audit and Risk Committee convened a board meeting that lasted 7 hours. I was present for part of it to answer technical questions about regulatory frameworks and remediation options. Daniel was present for part of it to answer questions about his decision-making. He emerged from the boardroom once during a break, pale and tight-lipped, and walked past me without a glance. When the meeting ended, the CEO's assistant scheduled separate one-on-ones, one for Daniel, one for me. Daniel's meeting came first. He was placed on administrative leave pending transition, which is polite corporate language for "we will pay you to go away quietly while our lawyers finish the paperwork." He was offered a severance package conditioned on non-disparagement and cooperation with regulators. Given what the board had just read, he accepted. My meeting came next. The CEO, flanked by the General Counsel and the Audit Committee Chair, thanked me for my professionalism and courage in raising concerns, acknowledged that the company's structures had failed to protect me from retaliation, and offered 2 things: a formal apology on behalf of the board and a promotion to Chief Compliance and Ethics Officer with a direct reporting line to the Audit and Risk Committee and dotted line to the CEO. My initial reaction was not triumph. It was a quiet, almost clinical recognition that the governance structure I had been arguing for in abstract memos for years had just been adopted because someone had finally seen the cost of ignoring it rendered in both numbers and video. The remediation process that followed was brutal and public. HelixSure self-reported the FlexGuard issues to regulators in 6 states and the Department of Labor. We initiated a full claims reevaluation for all mental health-related FlexGuard denials over a 3-year period, restored benefits where appropriate, paid interest, and sent letters admitting process errors and committing to improved practices. Several state insurance departments announced coordinated market conduct exams. The Colorado Division of Insurance, whose original complaint we had tried to minimize, opened a public investigation. A consumer advocacy group picked up the story. Within weeks, a major national newspaper ran a piece, "Insurer's Internal Video Raises Questions About Handling of Mental Health Claims," featuring a blurred still from the parking garage footage. That was the first time I saw myself on screen kneeling to pick up papers while a man in a suit walked away laughing. They did not name me, only a senior compliance officer, but everyone inside Helix sure knew, many people outside guessed. The headlines triggered class action attorneys, political commentary, and social media storms. For HelixSure, it was a reputational crisis. For me, it was exposure I had never sought and did not enjoy, but it had an effect. Regulators under public scrutiny pushed harder and faster. HelixSure, under capital market scrutiny, moved from defensive to cooperative. And other insurers quietly began revisiting their own short-term disability practices, not out of sudden moral revelation, but because they recognized that the cost-benefit calculus Daniel had relied on, accept the risk, pay a fine later if caught, had just shifted dramatically in the other direction. Inside HelixSure, my world narrowed to remediation. I led war room meetings with claims, product, legal, IT, and communications. We redesigned policy language, rebuilt claims workflows, retrained examiners, and implemented new controls that prevented any future CRO exception framework from being implemented without documented legal and compliance sign-off. I reported monthly to the Audit and Risk Committee, quarterly to the full board, and increasingly directly to regulators. The company paid millions in restitution and fines. We also, over 2 years, rebuilt trust, not fully, not with everyone, but enough that HelixSure remained solvent, licensed, and in business. In the process, my role shifted from the person slowing us down to the person who kept us from losing everything. It was not satisfying so much as appropriate. 6 months after the headlines, I received a call from a reporter who had been covering the story, asking whether I would go on record about the internal culture at HelixSure and the retaliation captured on video. I declined. I was not the story. The story was systemic: incentives, governance, structures that turned human weakness into institutional misconduct. The CCTV footage had made my humiliation visible, but the real work was invisible: emails, memos, controls, attestations. Those rarely make good television. They do, however, change outcomes. The investigation made headlines because there was video, because humiliation is visceral and audiences understand it immediately. But the reason that video mattered was not that a man jabbed a finger into my chest in a parking garage. It was that the person he was trying to bully controlled a function he could not quite erase: the obligation to tell the truth to regulators, to boards, and, in the end, to the public. My humiliation was caught on CCTV. The investigation exposed a multi-million-dollar injustice in how mental health claims were being denied across an entire product line. Daniel lost his job and quietly his reputation in the industry. HelixSure paid for what it had done and changed how it operated. And I kept doing my work, now with a title that reflected what I had been doing all along, holding the line between what tempted executives and what the law and decency required.